We like to think resistance is heroic. We dress it in fire and flags, in dramatic stands and famous speeches. We tell stories of defiance like they're clean, like they always ended in victory. But real resistance is not always loud. It's not always seen. And it almost never ends with applause. It ends in exile, in silence, in a prison cell, sometimes at the gallows. And that's why the word still unsettles us. Because resistance is not just about saying no to evil. It's about refusing to be shaped by fear, even when fear wears the face of law, religion, or majority. It's about conscience that stays standing when everyone else bows. And in the 20th century, no one embodied that kind of resistance more fully or more painfully than Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He didn't just disagree with evil, he resisted it, not for recognition, not out of rage, but because his faith left him no other choice. He wasn't a revolutionary, he was a pastor, a theologian, a man who believed that obedience to Christ would cost him everything, and still obeyed. And now, decades later, his story refuses to fade. Because while the world may have changed its language, its platforms, its headlines, the forces that silence truth, reward conformity, and punish conviction are still alive. So this isn't just a history lesson, this is a warning and an invitation to remember why resistance mattered then, and why it still matters now. It was 1939. Bonhoeffer had every reason to stay away. He was in New York, safe, respected, surrounded by friends, far from the choking grip of Hitler's Germany, far from the collapsing church, far from the darkness closing in on the people he loved. But distance does not protect the soul, and Bonhoeffer knew it, because while others saw escape, he saw abandonment. While others spoke of strategy, he felt the quiet pull of obedience. He wrote, "I must live through this difficult period of our national history with the Christian people of Germany." No one was forcing him. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He had no illusions of changing the outcome. He simply knew to be faithful he had to be present. To shepherd a suffering people, he had to suffer with them. So he got on a boat and sailed back, not into hope, but into fire. He walked back into the regime that would silence him, back into the churches that had bowed to power, back into the fear, knowing exactly what it would cost. This is where Bonhoeffer's resistance began. Not with a speech, not with a movement, but with a decision of conscience to refuse the safety of distance, to return when silence was convenient, to walk with Christ, even if it meant walking alone. That moment still matters, because today resistance may not mean a ship across an ocean, but it still means this: choosing presence over self-protection, choosing conviction over calculation, choosing to return when everything in you wants to run. Bonhoeffer didn't start his resistance with marches or manifestos. He started it with a sentence: "Only he who believes is obedient, and only he who is obedient believes." It was more than theology. It was defiance, disguised as doctrine. Because while the church bowed its head to Hitler, Bonhoeffer refused to bend his theology to power. He believed that faith without obedience was not just weak, it was false. And obedience to him meant following Christ even when the entire church was drifting into darkness. This is why the confessing church was born, a fragile, persecuted minority of pastors who stood up and declared, "Christ alone is Lord, not the Führer. Truth is not decided by party lines, and we will not baptize evil just to survive it." That's what made Bonhoeffer dangerous. He didn't call for riots, he called for clarity. He didn't try to build a movement, he simply told the truth and watched as the powerful trembled. Because truth, when spoken in a world addicted to compromise, is the most subversive thing there is. The Nazi regime feared his words, but more than that, the compromised church feared them too. Because Bonhoeffer made it clear, you cannot call Jesus Lord and remain silent while people are crushed. You cannot claim truth and let lies walk through the sanctuary unchallenged. His resistance was not political first. It was theological, spiritual, rooted in the conviction that the gospel is not something you protect. It's something you live, even when it costs you everything. When the visible church bowed to power, Bonhoeffer didn't run to the public square. He went underground. In 1935, in defiance of Nazi regulation, he established a secret seminary in a quiet place called Finkenwalde, a simple house hidden from view, watched by the Gestapo. There were no banners, no protests, only a group of young men and a guide who knew that faith would soon cost them everything. Here, Bonhoeffer taught more than theology. He taught them how to die, not with weapons, with obedience, with prayer, with integrity. Each day began with silence, scripture, confession, community. They didn't train to lead churches, they trained to become witnesses in the ruins. Men who could stand firm when the church around them collapsed. This wasn't retreat, it was rebellion, holy, quiet, radical formation. Bonhoeffer believed the world wouldn't be changed by louder voices, but by deeper roots, and that's what he gave them. Finkenwalde was where resistance became a rhythm, obedience over outcome, discipline over popularity, holiness over influence. The Gestapo would eventually shut it down, but they couldn't erase what was forged there. A generation of men who had learned that true resistance isn't forged in reaction, but in formation. And Bonhoeffer? He didn't just teach it, he lived it. Because the fire that started in Finkenwalde would soon be tested in prison, betrayal, and death. In 1937, Bonhoeffer wrote the words that would ignite his most dangerous resistance yet. The book was called The Cost of Discipleship. But it wasn't a devotional. It was a warning, a theological grenade tossed into the heart of a church that had sold its soul to survive. And at the center of it was one phrase that tore through generations of comfort. Cheap grace is the deadly enemy of our church. Cheap grace. Forgiveness without repentance. Comfort without conviction. A Christianity that asks nothing, costs nothing, changes nothing. Bonhoeffer saw what others refused to admit. That the church's collapse under Hitler didn't begin with fear. It began with theological laziness, with pulpits that preached grace, but never called for obedience, with believers who wanted salvation, but not surrender, with pastors who traded the cross for credibility. And he knew, if grace doesn't shape how we live, it will never shape what we're willing to resist. This was the essence of his resistance. He wasn't trying to be provocative. He was trying to wake up a sleeping church, a church that had mistaken survival for faithfulness. Bonhoeffer's resistance was rooted in this truth. If you preach Christ crucified, but won't confront the crucifying powers of your age, you are not preaching Christ. And that message, it made him more dangerous than any rebel. Because he wasn't yelling. He was writing, teaching, calling people back to a gospel that cost something. Because it was something, the church thought it could remain neutral. But Bonhoeffer showed that neutrality in the face of evil is not neutrality, it's consent. And he paid the price for saying it. Bonhoeffer had always believed in non-violence. He taught it, preached it, lived it. But there came a point where silence felt like betrayal, where prayer alone felt like an excuse, where theology, no matter how pure, had to move. And so he crossed a line. In 1940, Bonhoeffer became involved with the Abwehr, a covert military intelligence unit that, beneath the surface, had become a hub for resistance against Hitler. This was no longer about ideas, this was about action. And Bonhoeffer, the theologian, the pacifist, the quiet pastor, began working with a conspiracy to stop the evil he could no longer watch from the outside. He wasn't planting bombs, he wasn't carrying weapons, but he was helping orchestrate resistance, smuggling intelligence, saving lives, and standing with men who would eventually try to assassinate Hitler himself. This wasn't revenge, it wasn't rebellion. It was conscience that could no longer bow. He once wrote, "We are not simply to bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice, we are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself." This was that spoke. Bonhoeffer knew what it meant, that he was risking everything, that the church might turn on him, that the state would imprison him, or worse. But the time for theoretical resistance had passed. Now it was real, messy, dangerous, costly. And this is why his resistance still matters, because he didn't act out of rage, he acted out of responsibility. Not because it was clear, but because it was right. It's easy to misread Bonhoeffer's resistance, to imagine a fiery rebel, to paint him as a political crusader or moral warrior. But that wasn't him. He didn't act out of outrage. He acted out of burden. Because real resistance doesn't come from ego. It comes from conscience that refuses to stay clean while others suffer. Bonhoeffer agonized over his involvement in the resistance. He wasn't comfortable with it. He wasn't sure. He wrestled with God, with his theology, with his own soul. He believed in peace, but he also believed in truth. And when the two collided, he didn't choose what felt righteous. He chose what was responsible. That's what made his resistance holy. Not that it was perfect, but that it was faithful. Even in moral tension, he stood in the space where most people collapse, where you have to choose between preserving your purity or protecting those who can't protect themselves. And he chose responsibility. Not because he wanted to, but because he could no longer look away. This is what separates Bonhoeffer from most historical heroes. He wasn't trying to win, he was trying to obey. And that's why his resistance still matters. Because it wasn't built on certainty. It was built on conviction that trembled but didn't bow. He didn't act with arrogance, he acted with fear and faith that overruled it. In April 1943, the silence ended. Bonhoeffer was arrested. No crowds, no speeches, no trial, just a quiet knock, a cold hallway, and the slow, steady closing of every door around him. He was taken to Tegel military prison, accused of undermining the state, implicated in resistance activities, stripped of all protections. And suddenly, the world that once applauded his intellect and admired his sermons vanished. The church didn't defend him. Friends fell away. Letters went unanswered. His name became dangerous to speak aloud, because that's what real resistance costs. Not just your safety, your belonging, your identity, your voice. He had chosen integrity over survival. And now survival was no longer an option. But here's the miracle. He didn't break. He prayed. He wrote. He encouraged others, even as the walls closed in. And in those quiet days, behind concrete and bars, Bonhoeffer's resistance became something even more powerful. It became still and unshakable. Not because he had hope of rescue, but because he had already made peace with the cost of saying no to lies, the cost of standing when others knelt, the cost of truth, when truth leads to chains. He once wrote, "Who stands fast? Only the man whose final standard is not his reason, his principles, his conscience, his freedom, or his virtue, but who is ready to sacrifice all this when he is called to obedience, and responsible action in faith. This was that sacrifice, not dramatic, not public, but absolute. Behind the walls of Tegel, Bonhoeffer was forgotten by many. But he was not silent. He wrote, not for applause, but for clarity. Not to teach, but to remain alive in spirit. His letters, smuggled out to friends and family, would later become one of the deepest treasures of 20th century Christian thought. There was no pulpit, no church, just a man and a pen in chains. And what emerged from that silence was not bitterness, but something far more dangerous, a deeper theology, a costlier obedience, a faith stripped of illusion. He wrote of religionless Christianity, not atheism, not denial, but a call to live as if God were silent and still obey, to stop waiting for signs, to stop performing belief for safety, to trust that God was still God even when rescue didn't come. This wasn't rebellion, it was surrender without defeat. It was the kind of resistance that stops shouting and starts enduring, the kind that believes in hope, even when hope has no proof. Bonhoeffer didn't write to save himself. He wrote because faith had to be lived, even behind bars. And every sentence carved in that place carried one quiet message: obey anyway, stand anyway, resist anyway, even here, especially here, because if faith can survive prison, if truth can speak through concrete, then resistance is no longer an action. It becomes a witness. In the final days of the war, with Germany collapsing, Bonhoeffer was moved from prison to prison, from Tegel to Buchenwald, and finally to a place built for disappearance, Flossenburg concentration camp. There were no trials, no last appeals, only an order and a rope. On April 9th, 1945, just 2 weeks before the camp was liberated by Allied forces, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was executed, stripped of everything, no fame, no following, no future, but not of peace. Witnesses said he knelt to pray before he died. One SS doctor, hardened by the routine of death, said, "I have hardly ever seen a man die so entirely submissive to the will of God. There was no spectacle, no resistance in the flesh, but in spirit he was never more defiant, because the power that killed his body could not touch the truth he lived. That obedience is stronger than fear. That resistance is not measured by result, but by faithfulness. That death is not defeated if it comes from a life surrendered." Bonhoeffer's final act wasn't a speech, it was stillness. A life lived all the way to its edge and offered, quietly, into God's hands. The Nazis erased his name from their files, but they couldn't erase his witness from history, because the man they tried to silence is still speaking, not in vengeance, but in faith that endured, even unto death. We often think resistance is a single decision, a bold moment, a speech, a headline. But Bonhoeffer's life tells another story. Resistance wasn't a reaction, it was a way of living. It began long before the Abwehr, long before prison, long before the gallows. It began in the quiet, in the refusal to compromise truth, in the decision to return when it was safer to stay away, in the daily discipline of forming a soul that wouldn't bow. And that's what makes it powerful, because anyone can stand once. But Bonhoeffer didn't just stand, he remained, through rejection, through betrayal, through uncertainty, through isolation. He didn't know what the outcome would be. He didn't resist because he believed he would succeed. He resisted because obedience demanded it, whether or not the world changed. That's the kind of resistance the world needs now. Not louder opinions, not bigger platforms, but people who live in such alignment with truth that their very presence becomes an act of defiance, not out of pride, but out of quiet, burning conviction. Bonhoeffer's life teaches us resistance isn't always loud, it isn't always seen, but it must always be faithful, because when faith stops confronting evil, it becomes part of it. We tell ourselves the world is different now, that Bonhoeffer's time has passed, that resistance belongs to history, that we no longer need to stand because we're not facing tanks, tribunals, and tyrants. But evil has changed its clothes. It no longer shouts. It whispers. It doesn't march down the streets. It hides behind algorithms, behind branding, behind words like tolerance, neutrality, unity, all weaponized to avoid confrontation. And the church? Far too often it echoes those whispers. We no longer remove the cross. We just soften its edges. We don't preach obedience. We offer inspiration. We don't confront evil. We curate our silence. But Bonhoeffer's resistance still matters because the patterns are the same. A church afraid to lose its influence. A public more outraged by division than by injustice. A generation mistaking comfort for peace. The lines may look blurrier now, but the pressure? It's identical. Stay quiet. Don't get involved. Protect your platform. Keep it safe. And just like then, it rewards those who bow, with applause, with promotion, with peace that looks real, but is built on denial. This is why Bonhoeffer still speaks, because even now, the real threat isn't the storm outside, it's the silence inside, the silence that forgets what it means to follow Christ. When following Christ demands resistance. In times of darkness, the most dangerous voice is not the one shouting evil. It's the one saying nothing. It's the one that shrugs, that steps aside, that claims to be above it all. And nowhere is that silence more damaging than in the church. Bonhoeffer watched as pastors, bishops, and theologians refused to speak. Not because they supported Hitler, but because they wanted to stay out of it. They said things like, "We don't do politics. It's not our place to interfere. We're just here to preach the gospel." But Bonhoeffer saw it clearly. A gospel that does not confront injustice is not the gospel, and neutrality in the face of evil is not faith. It's betrayal. Today the language has changed, but the posture has not. We say, "That's not my issue. We don't want to be divisive. Let's just focus on unity." But what kind of unity are we protecting? What kind of gospel are we preaching if it costs us nothing? Bonhoeffer's life is a mirror and a warning because he wasn't condemning outsiders. He was calling out his own house. And that's what makes his resistance unbearable to those who still want to hide. He didn't just stand against tyrants. He stood against our excuses. He showed that the greatest threat to truth isn't always persecution. Sometimes it's the refusal to take a side. And that silence, that refusal, that desire to stay neutral, it doesn't protect the gospel, it betrays it. Most of us will never stand in front of a dictator. We'll never be arrested for our faith. We won't be called into underground networks or plots or prison cells. But that doesn't mean we aren't being tested. Because resistance today doesn't always come with flashing lights. It comes quietly, through decisions that no one sees. It looks like refusing to lie when everyone else does, to keep your job. Speaking truth when it costs you reputation. Living clean when compromise would be easier. Telling the truth from the pulpit, even if it empties the room. Choosing the cross over the algorithm. Resistance looks like integrity that doesn't bend, even when no one's watching, even when there's no applause, even when the church around you goes silent. Bonhoeffer's story isn't a call to dramatics, it's a call to discipleship, because the resistance God asks of us will almost always begin with the choice to obey. When it would be easier to adapt, it will feel inconvenient, lonely, costly. But that's how you know it's real, because truth in a culture of silence is resistance, because conviction in a system of comfort is rebellion, because saying no when the crowd says yes is the narrow road. Bonhoeffer didn't call us to be loud, he called us to be faithful. And sometimes the most powerful form of resistance is simply not bowing. Bonhoeffer didn't seek a legacy. He didn't write to be remembered. He didn't resist to make history. He obeyed because he couldn't do otherwise. He returned to danger. He stood against the regime. He defied a silent church. He walked into prison and didn't turn back. And in the end, when the rope was tied, when the world turned quiet, he still didn't bow, because his resistance was never about the outcome. It was about faithfulness. Faithfulness when safety was an option. Faithfulness when truth was unpopular. Faithfulness when everyone else went silent. That's why his life still confronts us, because in every generation the temptation returns to choose comfort over conviction, to call silence wisdom, to trade obedience for belonging. But Bonhoeffer's witness remains, not as a statue, not as a story, but as a challenge. To speak when we're told to be quiet. To stand when it would be easier to disappear. To live in such a way that compromise becomes impossible. He once said, "Being a Christian is less about cautiously avoiding sin than about courageously doing God's will." That's the stand, not to be noticed, not to be remembered, but to be found faithful when no one else is watching. So if you want to honor Bonhoeffer, don't quote him. Live like he did. Obey when it costs you. And resist, not because you're strong, but because you will not bow.